I'm Alona Minkowski, and you're watching HuffPost Live. Tensions between NATO and Moscow are escalating after Russian warplanes crashed into Turkish airspace twice over the weekend. The incursions come less than a week after Russia announced that it would start conducting airstrikes in Syria. NATO has rejected Russian authorities' continued claims that the airspace violation was an accident.
It's unacceptable to violate the airspace of another country. And this is exactly what we were afraid of, that incidents, accidents may create dangerous situations, and therefore it is also important to make sure that this doesn't happen again.
Meanwhile, as NATO continues its fight against ISIS in Syria, the terror group has claimed responsibility for a number of deadly attacks on the Yemeni government, as well as Saudi-led coalition troops. With more on the ongoing fight against the Islamic State in both Syria and Yemen, I'm joined now by Hakeem Al-Masmari, the editor of the Yemen Post, Sama Al-Hamdani, a Yemen analyst and researcher, Yanni Koutsanis, the director of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia at NYU, and Akbar Shahid Ahmed, HuffPost Foreign Affairs reporter. So I want to thank you all for joining me today. And Yanni, why don't I start with you, and we'll start with what's happening here between Russia and Turkey. What do you make of this back and forth as to whether it was an accident or not? Would it be in Russia's interest to not have it be an accident and to do something like this on purpose?
Well, countries will do this all the time. They're going to test the boundaries, see how far they can go, establish a presence also, sort of muscling into a certain kind of space. I wouldn't make too much of it. I think NATO is making probably too much of it and acting very self-righteous and all offended and whatnot. But we have to remember, this is a chaotic situation. Nobody really has the right to be there. Nobody can justify their presence there any better than the next person or the next country. I mean, NATO is there, but NATO is there under pretenses that aren't accepted by the established Syrian government. Russia is there, they're sort of invited, but there's a civil war going on. So the self-righteousness is probably going to go away. Russians are very good at highlighting the hypocrisy of other countries, and they're saying, well, who brought you here in the first place? Well, then the same question can be asked of Russia. So this is all the back and forth. Little by little, I think we're going to get a better sense that there is a shared enemy. The real dispute is, can this enemy best be fought by keeping Assad in power, or by continuing to fight against, to support various groups who are against Assad, and at the same time fight the Islamic State. The West is a little less clear about what its objectives are right now.
And that's the thing, right, is that there are seemingly many differing objectives here, which is why there are many different strategies and tactics being employed militarily against the Islamic State, or perhaps those that are just opponents of Assad. And so, Akbar, how do we also look at this in regards to the no-fly zone that Turkey had wanted set up so long ago?
I think it definitely links up to Russia's strategy here, which is to say we are taking the lead and we will define the rules on the ground, Alana. That's very much what their approach has been since they went in. As has been pointed out, no one has the right to be there, but Russia is able to say we're here on the basis of an invitation from a government. So they have this kind of moral high ground to stand on. And they're able to say Turkey, the U.S., other players who have ties to Syria aren't working with the Assad regime. It looks like what they're doing is similar to what they've done in Europe over the past year in the Baltic states, also with Norway and Sweden, and near the UK, is kind of buzzing, like putting in Russian fighter jets, putting in submarines, and just saying we're here, we're present. That said, I don't think that's enough to dissuade the U.S., Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others who are supporting the Syrian opposition. These players, many of them have said, look, if Russia wants to amp up in Syria, we will amp up in Syria too. The fact that Russian airstrikes have shown to not be targeted on ISIS, with the vast majority are against more moderate, more nationalist elements of the opposition to the Syrian government, that gives these countries a basis to say, look, Russia isn't even that interested in fighting ISIS. They just want to protect Assad. We'll ramp up our support. So if anything, to me, Alana, it looks like tensions are only increasing, and we're not going to get Russia having its way necessarily anytime soon.
And speaking of that, too, I just want to show a little graphic here, and this is from a map that the New York Times put together as to where it is that Russian and U.S. airstrikes are hitting, because, of course, there is a lot of debate. Russia is saying that it is not trying to prop up Assad and target specifically American-backed and trained opposition forces to Assad, and yet if you look at where the Russian airstrikes have hit, it does seem like a lot of them are in the rebel territory, as well as some of the government territory, and less so in the places where the Islamic State has a stronghold, whereas U.S. airstrikes are, you can see, only really in those areas where we see the Islamic State having a presence. The Islamic State, excuse me, having a presence. Do you want to comment on that, Akbar?
I would just add, Alana, part of that is the Russians are certainly worried about Islamic extremism. They don't like ISIS. They have over 2,000 Russian citizens who are fighting with ISIS and who are a risk to them if they decide to go back to the Russian Federation. But working with the Syrian regime means that you get your target from the Syrian regime. And so the Russians are targeting where the Syrians tell them to hit. It's a difficult situation for them because the Syrian regime's focus isn't ISIS and hasn't been ISIS for years.
Now, I just want to say that Turkish President Erdogan said that he would not endure Russian violations of Turkish airspace and has said that Russia risked losing Turkey. If we look at this relationship, though, Yanni, who has more to lose? What is the political dynamic between Turkey and Russia?
Between Turkey and Russia, it's they don't have much of a direct relationship when it comes to these things because Turkey acts through NATO. Although Erdogan can make his case, that you're violating our airspace, and this is true, but it's not a rare thing for the region. So is that Turkey is violating its neighbor's airspace pretty regularly, again, to test the waters. So he's going to say what he has to say. He's going to defend his own sovereignty. But the real question is, so it goes like this. If we agree that our shared goal is to defeat Islamic State, do you do this by supporting a series of small opposition groups who are opposed to Assad? Or do you do it by propping up Assad and destroying those very same small opposition groups? And this is where we're stuck right now. And so the truth is that at this particular moment, the Western powers, that includes Turkey, don't have a clear sense of how Islamic State can be defeated. We know what they don't want. They don't want Assad. They don't want Islamic State. But they haven't made it clear how these small opposition groups can be a real viable alternative to Assad. Now, I'm not saying that Assad is necessarily a good thing. One can have a debate about that. But what is clear is that Russia has much more direction right now than the West, for better or for worse. The West needs to get its act together to figure out what is its policy and what's the end game for the West, from its point of view.
I want to move on now to Yemen, too, because if we talk about here just differing interests, the West, the United States also, of course, is involved in Yemen, has had counterterrorism operations going on there for over a decade. And yet now we see the Islamic State becoming more aggressive in the area as well. So, Sama, if we look at these terrorist attacks for which the Islamic State took responsibility, in which 22 people were killed at a Houthi mosque in Sana'a, as well as an attack against the Yemeni government in Aden. What does that say about the group's position in the country at this moment?
Obviously, it says that they're growing, they're operating more freely, they're getting more confident with their targets because they began with civilians at mosques. Now they're targeting the government at their headquarters, and they're targeting soldiers. So they're getting more confident in their ability to carry out tasks. The problem with ISIS in Yemen, though, or I would say the Islamic State in general, because ISIS is very specific to Syria, I would say the problem is that Yemen's war has been largely ignored by the media because it's so complex and a lot of people have a hard time understanding what's happening, that terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and ISIS have been kind of treated as another local actor when in fact they are part of transnational bodies that operate in several countries. And so in this war, in this particular war in Yemen, groups that are of Sunni extremism have kind of carried out attacks against the Houthi movement, which is why we haven't heard about a lot of the attacks that they carried out. However, their attention is now shifting towards the government, since the government has returned back to to Aden as a temporary capital ever since they stayed in the capital of Saudi Arabia, Riyadh, for 6 months. And so it's going to be really challenging for the Arab coalition to kind of come back to Yemen, because once they eliminate the Houthi militia, they have to face all these other groups that are taking hold of the country. So ISIS is growing. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is also growing. They have taken control of Al-Mukalla in the governorate of Hadramaut. And so it seems that all these kinds of militias are taking control of territories because the government has not been able to come back and regain control.
And there was a time, too, when people were saying that the Islamic State and the United States oddly find themselves on the same side in their opposition towards the Houthis. So, Hakeem, if we look at it now and where things stand, too, Samad just broke down some of the complications for us. But when it comes to the Islamic State and AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, is there any convergence between the two, or are they still diametrically opposed?
It's incredibly close, but also incredibly far. Both are jihadist groups. You have Al-Qaeda and you have ISIS. Both are seeking the same demands or have the same goals. However, Al-Qaeda is more organized when it comes to such operations in Yemen and have a stronger base in Yemen. Until months ago, ISIS was nowhere to be known in Yemen, and even until now, people are still in doubt that ISIS does have, or if ISIS does have a base or a leadership in Yemen. There's no names being announced, there's no leaders being mentioned, etc. Right now, the worry is that ISIS would use the hundreds of prisoners who fled the prisons or escaped prisons over the last couple of months due to war and recruit them, since Al-Qaeda is very strict when it comes to recruiting and has very strong recruiting policies, whereas ISIS does not have those policies and could easily recruit many. These attacks show that ISIS is growing in Yemen. However, it does show that their attacks are very targeted on both the Houthis and the government, and that they will hurt Yemen more than they will help. And that's why most Yemenis do not feel that they are truly a Yemeni party or a side where they have influence in politics, but rather try to cause chaos in the country by damaging anything that they feel is wrong in their view.
And, also, Sama, if we look at then the expansion of this conflict with the Islamic State starting to have more of a presence in Yemen, then where does that put Saudi Arabia in relation to them, right? Because so much of the conversation for a long time regarding what to do in Syria has been about whether it should be the United States, Russia, Western powers, or whether it should be regional powers that really try to deal with this issue. And so does that force Saudi Arabia to be dragged into it a little more?
Absolutely. Saudi Arabia is already dragged into it. The reason that Saudi Arabia and 9 other Arab countries have been involved in Yemen's war is because they believe that the Houthis are strongly associated with Iran. And so if you look at it that way, then you have to look at ISIS and Al-Qaeda as groups that are transnational with agendas to take over. I would say ISIS definitely threatens the monarchies in the Gulf. If we look at what happened in Saudi Arabia, there were 2 ISIS attacks that targeted Shia mosques in 2 different locations. And so it seems that they were going to go after, so it seems so far that ISIS is anywhere where there is what we call Shia presence. And so their first opponent is actually Muslims who do not adhere to their particular ideology. And so in this regard, it would start with Shia in Yemen. They've targeted an Ismaili mosque. They've also targeted any kind of government bodies, so soldiers, and now the headquarters, so the vice president of Yemen, Bahah, and his cabinet. And I would say that naturally we can assume that what would follow next is the Al Saud monarchy, and it would follow into the UAE. The United Arab Emirates has been very heavily involved in this war, and they've actually sent troops into Yemen. And their soldiers were actually killed in the last strike. So they had 4 soldiers die because of the targeting of the Arab Coalition Center. And so ISIS is really looking at the whole region as a possible territory. And here I need to remind our audience that back in 2011, and then even before that, we had territories in Yemen that were under complete control of these extremist groups. So it's easy for Yemen to kind of fall in the hands of these people because although the government used to be central, they didn't have complete control over all of Yemen's territories. And now with the war and with Yemen's government outside of the country and with the country being at complete chaos, it's going to be really hard. And so I would say that the international community and America particularly needs to kind of back a peace settlement in Yemen to ensure that the government comes back onto the ground and to make sure that they can secure territories that can fall in the hands of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So in this sense, Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries need to make sure that this war needs to end, to kind of contain the chaos, and to start the rebuilding process, which will curb the way that these terrorist organizations are able to kind of recruit and monopolize on the destruction that's taken place.
Well, on that note, too, regarding a peace process, Hakeem, there is news today that Houthi rebels have committed to a UN peace plan that they've confirmed in writing to the UN Secretary General. Their commitment to UN resolutions aimed at ending the country's conflict. Does that seem like a positive development to you? As in, do you buy it?
This was the same development that took place last month. We talked to top Houthi officials in Sana'a, and they said that this was the same agreement that they reached in September with nothing new added to it. They're still opposing the sanctions on their leaders, etc. So not much new, but the timing right now is for political reasons. But what I see is that the end of the Yemeni war seems to be the launch of ISIS in Yemen. And this was worries Yemenis that over the last month, ISIS has been targeting many targets, and lastly now being pro-government targets. So this shows that Saudi Arabia or its allies, for some reason, are trying to end the war right now. But however, the blood on the Houthi side will continue from the ISIS attacks to take place. So one era, one phase comes to an end while a new phase starts.
I actually, if I may add something, we don't know much about this settlement. We know that it was announced in the media. We don't know about the specific details, but there was a specific document that was leaked to the media a while ago by the new UN envoy to Yemen, and it had 7 main points. I would say that every time you had a peace settlement kind of go on the table, either the Houthi militia or the Arab coalition has worked very hard to make sure that this settlement is very literal and it won't get implicated. So actually applied. So at the start of the war, when the Houthis were kind of winning and expanding, they refused to take these negotiations seriously, and they tried to kind of avoid it. However, now it seems that they are losing in Marib and other places. And so it's very, I can completely see that they're willing to kind of adhere to this, but I feel that the Arab-led coalition is hesitant to kind of agree with them on this peace settlement because they feel like they're reaching an end. Having said that, there's been a stalemate and they've been fighting for months. And so I think this is where the international community can really play a role in kind of pressuring both parties to adhere to UN Security Council Resolution number 2216 to kind of curb the influence of the Houthis and to kind of slow down the airstrikes that the people are facing. Because while these two parties are fighting on the ground, the majority of Yemeni civilians are left without jobs. They're facing famine. They don't have access to medication. The humanitarian crisis continues to grow worse and worse every day. And access to clean water is becoming a very serious issue that nobody in the international community or even in Yemen on the ground can address seriously in the midst of a conflict that's taken place.
Yeah, and this certainly is a human rights crisis, and it's one that we've covered many times here on HuffPost Live. But overall, Akbar, you can see how what's happening in Yemen has been overshadowed by what is happening in Syria. And so, I guess the question for me is if we're bringing a lot of pieces together here, but so much of this does seem to be happening below the radar, right? But with the United States, as I mentioned before, has had long counterterrorism operations going on in Yemen and has given tacit approval to the Saudi Arabia bombing campaign in the country. At the same time, what the United States has been doing in Syria has not technically been approved by Congress. And right now, the United States is under fire for bombing a Doctors Without Borders hospital in Afghanistan, where there were a lot of civilian casualties too. And a lot of people feel like the war in Afghanistan is over. So all of this kind of coming to the forefront at once, though, can it put a little more pressure on for more straightforwardness in addressing where we are involved, what's happening, what we're doing, and maybe getting some type of congressional action and approval on it?
I don't think that's likely, Ilona. It would be nice if it were to happen. I think that's certainly rethinking on the Syria strategy. But on the Yemen piece, even as Hakeem and Sama were noting, there have been some steps with the Houthis saying they might be willing to talk. The U.S. is supporting the Saudi-led coalition there, and the Saudi-led coalition there doesn't seem like it wants to end the conflict anytime soon. We had the first big Senate hearing on Yemen in weeks yesterday, and we didn't hear anything new on what the U.S. was really planning to do. My understanding right now is that the administration is looking at Syria, looking at Yemen, and wants to take as much of a hands-off approach as possible. That's reflected in Yemen, where they've continued drone strikes on al-Qaeda targets while allowing al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula to control a city, to control parts of the country. They are only targeting militants who they see as threats to the U.S. And in Syria, there's a lot of talk about where is this going to go. We don't see a lot of expansion of U.S. involvement or investment. What the U.S. does seem to be doing is covert and, again, very specific and targeting. What I think people in the region would say, Gulf countries, the Afghan government, which has been very upset by the U.S. treatment of this bomb in Afghanistan, is that the Obama administration kind of needs to step up and own these conflicts, something it doesn't seem to want to do right now. Step up and say, here's what we want to see in Yemen, here's what we want to see in Syria, and we aren't seeing that from them yet.
Yeah, and certainly those are criticisms that have been around for quite a while. We have to leave it there, but Hakeem, Sama, Yanni, and Akbar, thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, guys, keep watching HuffPost Live. Much more coming up.